forward to this computer, but I have it set to go to the little drive, I'm pretty sure. Mine looks like it's also recording. So I'll introduce you.
All right.
Okay, great. So, hi, I'm Jen Stein. Welcome to Mainline MUFON for December. My guest today is Nancy duTertre. I'd like to tell you a little bit about her background. Nancy is an attorney. She's licensed in New York and New Jersey, and she specialized in security litigation and corporate law. She's also a businesswoman and was the owner of a small printing company. She also owned a 242 skilled bed nursing home in Brooklyn and a healthcare newspaper in New York City. Nancy has managed a U.S.-based operations of a family-owned business that dealt with French Limoges porcelain manufacturing for many years. She's also an artist. She's the author of a book on art history that deals with the art of Limoges boxes. And Nancy is a graduate, magna cum laude, from Princeton University with honors, and she's also worked and published in their law review. And she's also written for the law review of Pace University Law School. Nancy is also a trained psychic detective, and she's worked with law enforcement agencies and police detectives and the victims of families in several states to help investigators find lost and missing persons. She's a trained spiritual medium, and she studied with the Spiritual Life Fellowship in Ringfield, New Jersey, and also the British Spiritualist National Union, which represents about 340 spiritualist churches in England, and that was established in 1853. She is also a well-known energy medical intuitive, and she's trained with former military remote viewer Lynn Buchanan, and on multiple levels of controlled remote viewing, which is known as CRV, and she's familiar and has used protocols that have been developed for the CIA and the DIA. Nancy is a certified in intuitive Gestalt dialogue method, which is based on Gestalt psychotherapy. And she's trained for more than a decade with Dr. Ron D'Angelo, who is director of the Center for Dialogical Training at the Soma Psychic Institute in New York City. She has written several books on intuition and psychic phenomenon, including the neurological implications of psychic sensing. And during the course of her research, she's interviewed some of the world's most famous psychics, mediums, neuroscientists, physicists, healers, and artists. And Nancy's also published numerous articles for law enforcement magazines. And not surprisingly, Nancy is a very well-known television personality. She's made appearances both on Canadian television and the United States, notably Mystery Hunters, and also on the Sundance Channel on the program Love, Lust, and the Paranormal. And she's a frequent guest on hundreds of internet radio programs, including the nationally syndicated Coast to Coast show with George Norrie. So I am really, really delighted to have Nancy here today with us at Mainline MUFON to present. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but we're technically savvy and we can do this via YouTube and via Zoom. And Nancy has worked very hard to prepare some great information for us today. So thank you, Nancy, for joining us and for presenting with us. It's, for me, it's really a great pleasure to have you.
Well, likewise, of course. And thank you for that introduction. I didn't mean for the stuff I've done to become a tongue twister.
Right. I know it is a bit. It is a bit. And I actually read through it once or twice beforehand, but it is a bit of a tongue twister. But it just shows your huge diversity. And it also shows to me the practical background with which you come to the whole realm of psychic phenomenon. You come from sort of more a skeptical and disbelieving or prove it to me position, which is something I've always admired about you, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's, I think it's important. You got to maintain balance.
Yeah.
And so that's what I try to do. And I know you do too.
I do try. That's right. That's right. But I also pay attention. And we've talked about that in depth before. When you get a psychic message 3, 4, 5 times, just sit back and listen to it, pay attention to it, because it may be there for a very important reason. And it may literally be saving your life or someone else's.
100%. Yeah. And I actually just spent one of my, I teach a certain type of remote viewing called TSP that I call next generation, because it sort of, I believe it goes beyond, traditional methods of controlled remote viewing or CRV or associative remote viewing, extended remote viewing that have been around for a while. So I was just actually talking about when something becomes real, you have to pay attention. And people said, well, how do you know if it's real? How do you know if it's not just, something going off in my head? And it's all about feedback. And feedback is one of those, real three-dimensional empirical things that we all have to deal with. We're in physical bodies, but feedback gives us real information about the really important psychic data that goes on with us also.
Right. And it's the way you can evaluate this information, like you're saying. It gives you a bit of a barometer. It gives you data, like in any other field. You look for data.
Yeah.
Right.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to let you control the screen from here. I understand you've put together a great PowerPoint presentation.
Well, hopefully it's going to be relatively brief enough so people won't get too bored. And then hopefully it also raises some questions that we can talk about at your next meeting.
Great.
So, okay, let me do that. And can you see that?
Yes, very well.
Okay, good. All right, so my topic today is going to be, what is a download? And I haven't seen anybody else do this, okay? Whoops, I hope I'm not flipping through too quickly. It's being done automatically. You've already done sort of an introduction on me. I didn't know if, you would or not. So basically, this is just a recap of what you've said. 2 books that would probably be relevant to your members would be either Psychic Intuition or How to Talk to an Alien. And they're both sort of relevant, I think, to this topic of downloads. So Mike, I started out with a question, what exactly is a download? And I know that I started to hear people talking about this maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years ago. And people say, oh yeah, wow, I had such a download yesterday. It was amazing. And I kept thinking, well, wow, this must be some experience that people are having. It's a new thing. I don't know what it is. I know if I get, a flash of insight about something, it'll feel maybe like what they're talking about with a download, but it seemed to have a different meaning for people. And I would say particularly, it had a different meaning for experiencers and contactees. And I have had my own, certainly plenty of sightings of UFOs, significant sightings, and I've had contact. And I didn't have, at least I didn't think I had what people talked about when they kept saying they've had these downloads. Every time I would ask them about it, it would, you know what, let me start this over because it's flipping me automatically, which I'm not happy about. Give me 1 second here. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thanks.
It should not have been doing that, strangely. Okay, I'm back here again. Okay, so anyway, people experience the process and the content of downloads very differently. This is what I've discovered. And I think the real question is, where does the download come from? Is it coming from somewhere else? Or is it coming from inside of oneself? And it was very unclear to me, what people were experiencing that way. So what I did is I've interviewed a bunch of people about their download process. There are all of them are experiencers, contactees, okay? And essentially this is what I've learned, that there are 5 basic aspects I think you could characterize a download. It's a personal experience, it's very individual. It involves a large non-local data transfer of information, okay? It's difficult to understand, it's difficult to remember, and there is often a physical aspect of it. And that was sort of surprising to me. I somehow just didn't expect that. So to go to the first criterion, okay, very individual personal experience. Well, people I've talked to experienced it many different ways. You can see some people describe it as telepathic communication. Others describe it as part of the alien or ET experience. Some said it's a flash of insight, a creative inspiration, a sudden kind of discernment, a sudden recognition of truth. Other people say it's a form of intuitive knowledge. So it has quite a few different ways in which it manifests. And I interviewed a bunch of people who I know, friends and colleagues, and I wanted to share some of their reactions when I asked them, what is a download experience? In general, the first thing up here, a mental directive. It's quite common, at least in, my talking to people who are experiencers or contactees. Very often they'll hear telepathically, go outside now with your camera and wait. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't know why they received that message, but they got it. They go outside with their camera, and then suddenly there's, an appearance of a UFO, or they have a contact experience. Okay. This fellow here, Michael Arellano, he says for him, it's a psychic communication from an alien being. He's a lifelong experiencer, as are, I believe, all the people I interviewed on this. Eric Hope, he says for him, it's like a passive experience of a creative or artistic inspiration. Okay, so it's got that sort of inspiration feel for him. For Tamara Scott, she's the head of the Orange County MUFON out in California. She said for her, it's a sudden inspiration that arrives fully formed and manifests as reality later. And I think that's an important aspect too. It's not fully understood or formed, as she said, when you get it. Rebecca Hardcastle-Wright, the founder of the Institute for Exoconsciousness, and I work with her on that. She says these downloads are mysterious because the data is meaningless when received, but it becomes obvious later. Maria Leva, she is also a lifelong experiencer. She works with me on the TSP remote viewing training. And for her, she says, information comes quickly and occupies my body and brain as a telepathic conveyance. So now you've got that aspect of a very fast, sort of an information dump, I guess you could describe it as. It's really quick. For Sandy Clevin, who is also lifelong experiencer, been very active in a lot of the UFO conventions and that kind of thing. She says she will see or feel pictures or images. She said downloads don't correlate with particular events. And she leaves the source wide open. She says it could be ETs, angels, psychic data, or government technology. And then my dear friend Doris Bernardi, who is an opera singer and teaches music in very unusual ways to her students. She says downloads reveal their sound in visual or auditory spectrum. It reveals something so it becomes obvious. A reality playing within a reality. It arrives in multiple dimensions. So it's a very, very complex and layered type of an event that, as you can see, everybody sort of gets a slightly different experience of it. The second criterion that I've talked about is that a download involves large and non-local transfers of data. Okay, so it arrives suddenly, often without warning. It's characterized by very unusual information, not normally known, okay, um, or by a sudden synthesis of information, creating a new thought or a creative process. It's frequently experienced as arriving from an outside or a non-local source. And as I say, a lot of times it's really difficult to understand. It's almost incomprehensible. You get so much so fast. And it may also be due to the fact that it's very often, I think it's arriving in an unknown format. If you can imagine, let's say, a sending computer, a large computer system that is transferring data to a smaller, let's say a laptop. And let's say the sending computer is using JavaScript language, but the receiving computer only understands C++ language. Well, right there, you're going to have a problem of comprehension. You know, how is that local computer, the smaller one, going to understand what's being transmitted? So here, basically what I'm discussing is alien thought format that has to be translated into our human thought format, okay? And the source, as I mentioned here, could be any number of things: alien, multidimensional being, God, angels, higher self, spirit, cosmos, energy, technology, collective unconscious, and there are probably others I haven't thought of. And it gets communicated in a certain language, and we, the humans, have got to figure out over here how to translate or to interpret that language into something that we understand. The fourth criterion is it's really hard to remember. And so that's not a big surprise if you're getting suddenly a huge amount of information being given to you in a format that may not be totally familiar to you, or it might be unrecognizable. So yeah, it's going to be very difficult to remember what's being communicated to you. And this is something that I teach actually in my, my TSP remote viewing classes. How do you remember nonsense? If something comes in a format that feels like nonsense to you because it's unfamiliar and you don't recognize the symbols or the images, how do you remember them? And it's a little bit like the first thing when you wake up in the morning, you might have remembered every detail of your dream while you were in it, and then poof, it disappears as soon as your conscious mind wakes up. And so what you have to learn how to do is to sort of backtrack and find your way back into those images of your dreamscapes. And it's very, very similar, I think, with trying to remember the sort of what I'm calling nonsense that's going to show up frequently in downloads. And then the fifth criterion is it involves physical sensations, which frankly, I was really surprised by. I just didn't imagine that people would experience this so, you know, as a physical type of phenomenon, but they do. And to go back to the interviews I did with various people, it's interesting. So Rebecca Hardcastle writes, she says, I can feel the photons entering my body cells. It feels very different from a flash of insight. So for her, it's clearly not a mental phenomenon, it's physical. For Maria Leva, she says, something occupies my knowing. Information occupies my body and brain. It's a physical event. I can feel it as a pulse in my body. New information becomes a part of me. My being and new information collide. It could be similar to a seizure, wow, or a trance. So that's very strong. Sandy Clevin, she says, she actually gets a very strong mental image of something silver. It's an object. She says it's very ornate. It's designed on her mental screen. And then she feels a liquid pouring into her head. She says information is pouring in and coming with the knowing. I don't quite hear the information, I'm knowing it. It's a body sensation of pouring liquid. The top of my head will tingle or my third eye feels funny. And sometimes it feels like oil bubbling in an oil lamp. And again, for Doris Bernardi, also very intensely physical. So she says she gets these downloads 2 or 3 times a week, and the difficult ones, she says, knock me down. Sometimes they can last all day long or for several days. She says, I try to open 2 channels to stay both conscious and aware, which she feels are different. And she said, I feel like I've been electrocuted, like a combust or explode feeling. My whole body is drained. My heart feels strange. I feel like I'm numb when I'm coming out of a download. So again, very, very strong physical. Eric Hope, he says, occasionally I feel a buzzing on the top of my head. It's like a funnel thing happens that feels like it's got a little spin on it. You sit and it pours in. Again, there's that sense of pouring in. Tamara Scott, she gets downloads much more intensely associated when she's in water, you know, like a bath or a shower. She doesn't know why, but there's a connection, a physical connection there. And then Michael Arellano, he says, aliens had me focus on a jade-colored orb with gold glyphs moving around it above my head, not just pictures in my head. So again, for him, this was an actual physical reality that was included in this experience, okay, of a download. So I think we all know download is a computer metaphor. So we're taking computer terminology and we're applying it to mental phenomena. And the origin of this, I think, is really, if you look at the way that neuroscience has developed as a branch of science, what they've done is they have mapped the brain almost like you would map out a computer through its functions, okay? So they tend to view the brain in its capacity as kind of a biological computer. Engineering has taken this the next step further. What they're doing is they're taking the neuroscientific model of the brain as a computer, and they're taking that and they're applying it to AI and robots. So they're also mapping it out in this way that is sort of an analogy to a computer. Used to be in the old days, 20th century, we had different technologies. So of course, people referred to, or they made analogies to psi phenomena, which I believe are very much involved in downloads, okay? And they would refer to them by the old type of technology as a type of radio, television, or telephone. There, many people might have heard of Upton Sinclair, a very well-known author, and he wrote this tremendous book about telepathic experiments, and he called it mental radio. The early Soviet investigators into psi phenomena also used this radio kind of analogy. However, well, yeah. So when you're dealing with radio waves, you are dealing with generally a single sender, okay, that sends out information in a particular direction that is capable of being received by any number of different receivers. And I've given a bunch of, just to show as an example, different types of technologies that could pick up that type of a wave. And what this is essentially, it's an analog radio signal, okay? That's the comparison. So you have your sender who's telepathically sending a message to a receiver, and it's a one-way transmission of data, and it's analog. Today, we have now computers that have taken over everything. We've got information that exists in the cloud, on large, massive, data centers, going all the way out to various types of computers on different networks. We've got satellites, we've got thumb drives. So the computer has really taken over the concept of how information travels non-locally, okay, from one source to another, which is why I'm pretty sure we're all referring to these experiences as downloads, because they're like computer downloads. The point is, though, that today digital has become the way information generally is transferred. It's no longer analog. And the difference is, with digital, you're dealing with the famous zeros and ones, okay, it's binary, and they form clusters which represent symbols for either language or words or whatever, or even images. And that's quite different from the old analog radios, which were operating in real time with real electromagnetic waves. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, a lot of people are probably familiar with the famous Rendlesham Forest case, which was sort of it's considered Britain's Roswell event, okay? There were the twin military nuclear bases, one operated by the Americans, one operated by the British. And one day they see a craft, it lands in the forest in between them. So they send out a team to go out and investigate and take readings and measurements and that kind of thing. And it came out much later that Staff Sergeant Jim Penniston had, he had apparently touched the craft itself. And the minute he did, he felt like he received a form of a download. This download was actually in the form of a binary code, which he wrote down in his notebooks. And he held on to them for a long time. There's a lot of secrecy being compelled in this case among the people who were involved. But he eventually revealed this to Earth-Files ufologist Linda Moulton Howe. She gave it to an astronomer and a DNA scientist, and they managed to come up with some interpretations, okay, of the binary code. So a download can be literally received, literally, in zeros and ones as a binary code. Another way you can get a binary code experience from a download is you can experience it as sort of a Morse code. And now instead of having zeros and ones, you've got short and long of a sound, an auditory sound, a beep. And the way that you vary them, obviously, is by the rhythm, the duration, and frequency. So to me, it's almost reminiscent of writing music. So each group of long and short becomes sort of your binary code, and the sounds are then organized into a language to symbolically form thoughts, words, and concepts. And I know that I have experienced this occasionally. I don't know Morse code, so I haven't been able to interpret it. I know I have other friends and colleagues who've also heard this sort of a very faint kind of a beeping noise or a sound that begins to feel like some form of a download, but without that language to translate it. Since I don't know Morse code, it's hard to know what is being conveyed. I believe that downloads should actually be renamed, and we should call them downstreams. And I have several reasons for saying this, and I'm going to go over these, at length after this. Essentially, the human brain, because it interprets data, okay, through its own experience and language, it cannot make an exact duplicate copy of anything. It could be close, all right, but it isn't. Second reason is the human brain has trouble with memory retrieval. It also has trouble or insufficient memory storage. So downstream is actually a better word, because if you go and you look up what a download actually is, and I've put the definition up here, it's either a noun or a verb, okay, but it's the act of transferring data or files from one location, usually a large computer or the cloud, to a smaller computer or a phone or storage device. And what's key here is a copy of the transferred data is stored. Now, a new thing that's come up, relatively recently, within the last decade, I don't know exactly how long, but the concept of streaming data. And the definition of this is that it's very similar, okay, to a download, because you're transmitting data, usually video or audio material, which is actually more complex because it's not so sequential. And you're doing that over a computer network as a steady, continuous flow. And this is the important part, you're allowing playback to start while the rest of the data is still being received. And key to the whole thing, no copy of the data is stored. So let's suppose that you get a download, all right? And let's say the original download is The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. Pretty complex fresco or painting. And you get that, it's received in your brain. Now, if you were getting a pure download, you would get this exact copy. However, we know humans don't do that. You might remember, let's say, only a fragment of that in your brain. You might change its content. In this case over here, God has been transformed into a Black woman. Or you might keep the content but change the style. Like in this case, much more modern and colorful, nothing to do with those Renaissance colors or style. Or you might modify certain details in your mind, completely changing the meaning of what was downloaded. Okay, so that's why I think downstreaming is just a better way to describe what we're doing. Second reason is the brain has trouble with retrieving downloaded data. Okay, the human memory, we all know it's imperfect, except for those people who have eidetic or photographic memory. They can capture a heck of a lot more, but even those, they're not entirely 100% all the time because we're not computers. And then the third reason is we may not have enough storage for this level of downloaded data. So I decided just to see how much storage we actually have in our brains. And it's been calculated, which I thought was interesting, to be 2.5 million gigabytes. All right. And by way of comparison, today's cell phones have between 16 to 128 gigabytes. So we're doing pretty well by comparison to the average cell phone, which, by the way, the cell phones are doing a lot better than Apollo 11's entire operating system when they landed on the moon. They only were operating with 64 gigabytes. Yeah, and if you compare this to Yahoo's, this was in 2008, Yahoo's largest global computation center in 2008 was 2 million gigabytes. That's still 20% smaller than the storage of the average human brain. Okay, now what's I thought was also key to understanding is, you know, what happens when you fill up all the information? Why would you, or excuse me, fill up all the storage space? How would that happen? You just from data dumps or what? And it turns out in neuroscience that once you get competing or new information, okay, it may cause the information to be rewired in your neural network in your brain. And once it's rewired, it tends to be forgotten. The big question, I don't think anybody's answered this yet, is it erased? And this is relevant because we know that downloads contain massive amounts of new information. So that would be taking up storage capacity. Question is, how much does it take up? I believe that most downloads they would be more similar to a holographic transfer of data, okay? And what I mean by this is that these downloads are holistic, simultaneous, non-sequential, multi-sourced. They involve compressed data, multi-level, multi-dimensional. So it occurred to me, I wonder how much holographic information you could store. Well, it turns out they have these things. They're similar to DVDs or CDs, but they're called HVDs. They're holographic versatile discs, all right? So in 2018, on a single HVD, you could store 4 terabytes of data, which is the equivalent of 4,000 gigabytes. And that's more than 8 times the amount of a standard hard drive in a computer in 2007. So we've come a long, long way. However, let me just show you something. I think it creates a certain equation where we can really look at brain storage. Let's assume that an average, what I'm calling a downstream, is the equivalent of one HVD, which has 4,000 gigabytes. So if you did 625, or if you experienced 625 downstreams in your life, poof, you have used up the maximum brain storage capacity of 2.5 million gigabytes. It's gone. And that assumes you didn't remember anything else about your life. So that's why I think we don't have truly sufficient storage for these downloads. So we can't call them downloads. We have to call them downstreams, because we are playing them in real time as they are downloading. And I would suggest to you that these downstreams, because they're involving simultaneous multidimensional inputs, they're actually creating a new type of information flow into the human brain. And this literally creates new realities that didn't exist there before. They exist as a result of the inputs of the data. So this is a colleague of mine. He is very interesting. He's also, he's a lifelong experiencer. He's kept meticulous notes of what I always assumed were his downloads. Okay, so over here on the left, I asked him to explain, what is that? He's very artistic. I believe he has an engineering background as well. So he's very visual. And he said, I surmise it's part of a planetary system in close proximity to our solar system. And we are quite literally part of a binary system. Okay, so that would be new, that information. Over here, I asked him what this meant, and he said, well, it's a crop circle that plays into our binary system. The image in the crop circle and on the Roswell rock is a possible star date when planet 9 or Nibiru, planet X, whatever you want to call it, aligns with Earth, our moon, and its moon. And he's labeled each one of them in alignment here.
Interesting.
And he's also written about human engineering. So here's his, he says this is spliced DNA. These two here, he says, are two different bipedal DNA stacks. And by the word bipedal, he means beings that walk on their hind legs, on two legs. And then over here, and this is really why I had first gotten to know him, was because of the work that I've done in my research on alien languages, spoken, written, and telepathic. And he says, because probably you'll recognize that these kind of look like star languages here. He says these represent 6 different models of bipedal life as a base or building block, meaning the 6 differences and similarities of DNA. So how do you translate this? How does the human brain translate this? How do you even remember this unless you're really photographic memory or writing this down as it happens, downstreaming in my view. Anyway, so I asked him, I said, would you refer to your works as downloads? And he said, no, I wouldn't refer to these as downloads. I refer to it as a signal at first initially because I would meditate at night, both in bed and in lotus position, and practice circular breathing and then download the information. It is now prevalent, and because it's so much, it's a constant connection. So I asked him, how do you experience a download? And he said, at first I experienced it as a night meditation. It's now always prevalent. The only break I get is when I focus on tasks or on work. And I said, what's the source of these downloads? He said, the universe is, of course. It's in the ethos. I think what he meant was the ethers. Ethos has got a slightly different meaning. And I said, how frequently do you experience these downloads and for what duration? He said, it's all the time. It's 24/7. And by the way, what happens to your memory storage if you're getting these 24/7 for many years? All you need is 625 of those holographic experiences and you used up your brain's capacity for storage. Anyway, so I said to him, and what do you believe is the purpose of these downloads? And he says the purpose is to get mankind past rudimentary ideas in both technology and science. It's to help nudge mankind into new forms of thinking and inspire man to look in new directions. The purpose of these journals is to help save the species so that we can achieve space flight, real space flight, past rocketry into deep space, and help man in medical ways. So, as you can see from this, this is a connecting factor, I believe, in terms of the content of many, many, many downloads that people get, even if they don't totally understand them. There's a sense of helping our species. So I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about what are the sources of downstreams. And I would suggest to you that there are several. One example would be the alien or ET telepathic type of downstream. Now, this is a very famous case. Probably a lot of you are familiar with this already. This happened in 1994 at the aerial school in Zimbabwe. You had 64 school kids who are outside during recess playing, and they see several UFOs landing right at the edge of the playground. So they all go running over, and eventually an ET or alien or several come out, depending on which witness you're listening to. They had mesmerizing eyes, and the kids all of a sudden get these telepathic transmissions, and essentially the transmissions are warning them to protect the planet's environment and not to rely too much on technology, which I think is interesting. So literally, these are what these kids said that they were told. Quote, technology is not helping, technology is bad. Or another one, quote, we're going down a wrong path and we have to start recognizing what we're doing is detrimental and we need to make changes, unquote. Now, what's interesting is, and this is what these kids said even as adults, that we couldn't possibly have had those ideas in our heads at that young age. We just didn't. What did they know about technology or the environment or any of that stuff, or warnings? So it clearly came from an exterior source that was clearly connected to this UFO landing event. Another example, also involving young kids who couldn't possibly have known these things. 3 young shepherd children, very famous case. This is the Our Lady of Fatima case in Portugal. In 1917, they start getting visitations from Virgin Mary, and they start getting messages. Their messages were considered so important that they're stored with the Vatican, but they were released only over time, very, very carefully. Their first secret, okay, let's use different terminology, call it a download or a downstream, was a vision of hell. Second one, the end to the Great War and possible future world wars. Well, they couldn't have known at the time there was going to be World War I, World War II. And then the third one, which wasn't made public by the Vatican until 2000, was a vision of the death of the Pope and other religious officials. And there are people out there who believe that the Vatican actually didn't reveal the entire message, that it may be some more apocalyptic message. And this is what I'm calling a religious telepathic downstream, okay? Because it's coming from a religious source. It's being at least qualified that way. Then, don't forget, we've got what's known as synthetic telepathy, all right? This has been developed by US military intelligence agencies for a long time. It's a technology that uses artificial telepathy. It's a non-invasive technology that allows a soldier, it was initially developed in that type of a warfare type of a setting, to help a soldier merely think a thought, which would be a message, and then transmit it either to other soldiers or to other technologies or machines, such as, let's say, drones or things like that, that could then act on that information. Now, it's turned out, and I've known individuals who claim to have been suffering from this kind of synthetic telepathy that is also being used for, let's say, less noble purposes, all right? Things like crowd control, interrogations, torture, and creating super soldiers. And there are people who do truly suffer from this, and they begin to believe that they're maybe schizophrenic or psychotic because they can't account for this messaging. And then finally, another example of a different type of downstream would be from your higher self. Probably most of you know this is one of the famous pictures of Tesla. Now, Tesla claimed, or at least it's been said that he claimed to have possibly gotten some of his information from ETs, but also, his higher self. You take other people, the great inventors and scientists of the world, the Einsteins or let's say the Mozarts, musicians, artists, they are inspired by something that feels as if it comes from beyond themselves, okay? But there isn't a specific source that they can identify as being from beyond them. So last question, when is a downstream considered successful? And I would suggest that there are three possible ways you could look at that. It could be successful when it's been successfully delivered to the individual, or when the individual has understood the data, or when the individual has decided to act upon the data. So there are really three different ways of looking at these types of very, very complex transmissions and how we use them in our universe. So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you so much, Jen.
Wow. Wow. I am spellbound at the simplicity and the comprehensive understanding that you've just put forth in this. I can say bravo, because having had literally experiences myself, I can relate to so many aspects of your presentation, Nancy. It's profound. And I'm sure that you will be able to make use of this presentation in various ways. And I'm really looking forward to the people who tune in and watch it. You and I have shared on a number of levels, a film project I've been working on, trying to unpack the details of some alien writing on some alien artifacts, and you've been extremely helpful, as have a number of your students. And I also had the experience of having a daughter who was suffering from a brain tumor, which I was unaware of. And I literally had what I felt was like a being behind me, tapping me on the shoulder and pointing to a whole group of doctor's appointments saying, you're going to all these specialists to try to figure out what's wrong with your daughter, and you got to get them all talking to each other. Your daughter has a tumor. She needs an MRI. She needed it yesterday, not in a month or 2 months from now. And you got to wake up and start integrating this data. And I was just shocked when I got that download in 2003. I didn't know how to, what mother wants to hear their child has a tumor? But I acted on it, and everything ended up, was right on. And I had to make very critical decisions at very important periods of time that freaked me out to make these decisions. But I relied on the data. It ended up being 100% accurate, and I knew I was guided by something, a being, a spiritual being, whether it was a spiritual message or whether it was an ET message or whether it was psychic knowledge or whatever you want to call it. It really changed my life and made me appreciate, respect, and recognize and obey and listen and pay attention when that sort of stuff happens.
Yeah, that was brilliant. It's brilliant that you paid attention.
Yeah, and I didn't have a guidebook, there is no rule book to pay, in this field. You have to sense it and figure it out yourself. And what you have just provided is a great objective perspective on how do you deal with psychic knowledge? How do you deal with these these downloads. I've had the pleasure, as I know you have. I mean, I got to speak in depth at times about this with someone like Edgar Mitchell, who relied on psychic knowledge. In fact, he was responsible for bringing back, I think it was the Apollo 11 astronauts, when their oxygen tank exploded and they were going to die before they got home because they didn't have enough oxygen. And he was supposed to be on that flight and wasn't. For a variety of reasons, he got switched out and he went on a later flight. But he was the one who sat in the cockpit and literally had a download to figure out how to get these astronauts home with the oxygen they had and what materials they could use. And he just sat there and psychically figured it out and then instructed NASA in what to tell the astronauts. It's an amazing story, but he said it was all psychic knowledge. Yeah, it was all psychic knowledge. So the only way those astronauts got home alive is the fact that he sat down and listened and sat in the training cockpit and figured out, okay, what do they have plastic on board? You know, like, what do you mean they're supposed to create? They had to create like new oxygen things for themselves and minimize the oxygen use. So they didn't have oxygen in the capsule. They only had it preserved or reserved just for what they were going to breathe. And they got home on the skin of their, or the hair of their chinny chin chin, as he would say. So, you know, there have been times where this has been used and the general public is unaware of this, but this is very profound and important information. And I really commend you for, you know, condensing, looking at this under a microscope, providing a language with which to interpret and understand psychic download, psychic stream, and, you know, how the human has a capacity to pay attention to this information. It's just
Thank
wonderful.
you. You get it.
I do get it. I really do. I mean, I sat here and went, oh, wow. Yes, this makes sense. You know, so we won't need to continue here. What we'll do is this program will be put up to YouTube so people can access it. You'll be able to access it. Our Mainline MUFON members will. We'll send it out to other friends, and whoever wants to tune in for the Q&A, which I believe is in the middle of December. I don't have the date in front of me right now. I think, is it the 16th?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
16th. Yeah. Good. So we'll do a Q&A with whoever wants to participate, and that should be really interesting. In fact, hopefully I will also invite Rebecca Hardcastle to join us, and feel free to invite any of the people that you consulted with too, because I think having their input will even further flesh out these understandings.
I agree. I will do it. I'll get the word out.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy this gorgeous day in the Northeast where we are. We have really nice weather today. Well, it snows in other parts of the country, I hear. And we'll talk to you in the middle of December, if not before.
Okay, great. And just make sure I get the link so I can start posting it too.
I will. Hopefully it'll get posted to YouTube shortly. And as soon as I get the link, I will send it to you. Okay. All right. Blessings, Nancy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.